Hey guys, this is Brent with the specialist team here at Okta. Today I'd like to walk you through a really simple example of how we can use Okta workflows to solve for a contractor onboarding and offboarding use case using time-based actions. Specifically, what we want to do is to create a user in Okta in a staged status, and then have their account automatically activated on their start date. And then later we want to have their account automatically suspended after a certain number of days. There are a couple of prerequisites you'll need before we get started. First, you're going to need a Slack account connected to your Okta Workflows tenant. Second, you're going to need to set up a couple of custom profile attributes in Okta. And then finally, you're going to need Postman or something similar because we're going to use the Okta user API to create our users in Okta to start the flows off. Let's get started over in Okta. Okay, over in Okta, let's go into the directory profile editor section. And in the Okta profile, let's edit that and add a couple of custom attributes. What we want to add here are two attributes. One is going to be a Boolean value called contractor that indicates whether or not this user is a contractor. And then the second one is activation date, which should be the a string variable that is the activation date of this user that the workflow will key off of. So let's start with contractor. This actually wants to be a Boolean. Save that. And let's add activation date. And save. And that's all we need to do in Okta. Okay, now let's head over to the Okta Workflow Designer. Now, because our use case is based on time-based actions, we're actually going to use a table to store the current status of the user as well as the key dates that our workflow needs to operate on. So I'm in the table section. I'm just working in shared folders for now. I'm going to create a table. I'm going to call this table contractor access. And then I'm going to add some new columns. The first column I'm going to add is the user ID of the user. And this is obviously the Okta user ID. That'll be our primary key. I want a column called display name. Username. This is our Okta login. Okta create date. And Okta create date is going to be a type of date. This is basically the timestamp when the user was created in Okta. Next one will be activate date. This is also a date. This is the date that the user should be activated in Okta. And suspend date is the date in the future at which their account should automatically be suspended. And then finally, status. This is going to be a text field, and this is basically a mirror of the user's status in Okta. So at what point of the Okta lifecycle they are, whether they're staged, provisioned, active, or suspended. And that should do it for our table. All right, it's time to start building our flows. I'm just going to go over here to the Flows tab and create a new flow. And we're basically going to end up with three different flows here. The first flow is going to be triggered by the user creation event inside of Okta. So basically, anytime a new user is created in Okta, it's going to trigger the event hook, which is going to trigger our flow here. This first flow is going to basically just create a new user in that table for us that has the basic information about the user, their login, their user ID, that sort of thing, as well as their activation and suspend date. The table is then going to be used by the other two flows to act on that user. So the second flow will basically come along periodically and check to see if there are any users in that table that need to be activated, and we'll activate them if so. And then the last flow will check the table to see if there are any users who need to be suspended, and if so, it will suspend them. So let's get started with our first flow. All right, let's start off by giving our flow a name. Now, sometimes when I'm working in flows that act in sort of a sequence, I like to give them a numbering system in the name. So I'll do number 1 here. And this is the user created in Okta event or flow. And let's make sure we turn on save all data so that we can do some debugging later if we need to in the flow history. And pick save. And let's go ahead and kick off our flow. This is going to start with an Okta event. So in my connected apps, I want to click Okta, and then I want to pick the user created event. And you can see I've already got my Okta tenant set up as a connected application. And so you're probably familiar with this already, but basically what's happening here is that this card is parsing out all the pertinent information from the request from Okta, from that event hook. Most of the info we want is down here in this Okta user, so their user ID, their alternate ID, their display name, that sort of thing are all here. Now the next thing I want to do is, now that I've got the event, I want to look that user up in Okta because I need a little bit more information about the user before I can continue. So I'm going to pick read user, and the info I need to pull out here, let's see, I probably need username, first name, last name, and for sure what I need is this contractor attribute that we added to Okta, as well as the activation date attribute. So make sure we've collected those because we're going to need those to make some decisions about what to do next. Cool. And then for our login or ID, basically just pull the Okta user ID and drop it right there. Now, because I have an Okta user created event card over here, we're basically going to be triggering this workflow anytime a user is created in Okta. But the use case we're working here is just for contractors. So what I want to do next is check to see if the user is a contractor, and if not, I just want to exit out of this flow and not continue. The way I can do that is by clicking here and picking continue if. And what that's going to allow me to do is to say, let's change these to true false because that's the type of value we're working with here. Basically what I want to say is grab the contractor attribute from the read user. So we've got the user's contractor attributes, which is a true or false. And if it's equal to true, we'll continue. So basically this card will allow the flow to continue if contractor is true. If not, we can just return a message saying user is not a contractor and just be on our merry way. Let me save that. Next, we're going to calculate the user's suspension date, or basically their term date. What we're going to do basically is just add 30 days to their activation date. And the way we can do that is over here in function. Under date and time, we can pick date add. And what we're going to do is drag the activation date to the start date. And we want to add, in this case, let's say 30 days. So our contractors are automatically activated on their start date, and they're automatically suspended 30 days. We'll pick our unit here, 30 days after their start date. All right, before we go any further, let's rename this output field here to make it easier on ourselves going forward. I'm going to pick edit card, and I'm going to change the output name here to suspend date. It's always nice to rename output fields to something that's a little more meaningful so that as you get a little further down into the flow, you still know what's going on. So the next thing we want to do is to create a row in our table. That row is going to contain the activation and suspend date for this user, as well as their ID and their login name and that sort of data. And again, that table entry is going to be used by the flows that come along later to do the automatic activation and suspension of our users. So let's go to function. Let's go to tables, and let's do create row. And let's choose our table. So we're going to go to shared folder and pick our contractor access table and pick done. And now it's going to give us an option to pick some additional fields here. And we do want to select all of these because we want to update all these fields in that table. So just go ahead and collect all of those and pick done. And now what we need to do is just drag the pertinent data into this card. So you can grab the Okta user ID from any of these cards, just drag it in. Our display name is available here in the user created card. The username is available over here in this Okta read user card. Basically, we're getting a limited set of information in the event hook for the user created. That's why we did the read user to get all this additional profile information. So I can grab the username. The Okta create date, we're actually going to pull the date and time directly off the Okta user created event hook. And then for activation date, that was passed in on the API when we created the user, which will show later when we do the postman call. So I'm just going to drag the activation date in. And then the suspend date. That's what we just calculated by adding 30 days to the activation date. And then finally, the user's status is up here in the Okta read user card. And obviously, in this case, anytime we get into this point, this should really be staged. But we're going to use this to update their status throughout the process. And we're going to hit save. Okay, now that we've updated our table, the last thing we're going to do in this flow is to send a Slack message to a group notifying them that this contractor has been created with details about their activation and suspend dates. So let's start by composing a message. I pick function compose. I know this is going to Slack, and an asterisk in Slack will be bold, so I can put a bold character here and do let's see, new contractor headed to Okta. And then let's give their display name. And maybe in parentheses we'll have their Okta login name or their username. Oops. And then let's do their activation date and their suspend date. And then those we can just drag in from the read user card for activation date. And then we can drag in the suspend date from the date card where we created the suspend date. Cool, and that's our message. And the last thing we can do is go ahead and send that to a Slack channel. And then again, one of the prereqs here is to have a Slack channel or a Slack connection already set up. So I'm going to pick Slack, and I'm going to send a message to channel. Select my connection. I'm going to send this to the contractor onboarding channel. No, I'm going to send this as a bot. And then all I'm going to do is drag the output of this compose card into the text area, and then I'm going to give my bot a name, so we'll call it maybe onboarding bot, something like that, and save. And that does it for this flow. All right, let's go work on our next flow. So I'm going to go back to home. I'm going to pick new flow, and I'm going to name this one. And again, this is kind of sequential, so I'll call this one number 2. I'm going to call this one activate user on activation date. And I'm going to pick save. So what this flow is going to do is on a periodic basis, it's going to go look at that table and see if there are any users whose activation date is in the past or now, and it's going to activate the user and update their status, and also send a Slack message to that group notifying them that the activation has occurred for that user. So the trigger for this one, if we pick add event, is actually going to be a schedule. And so what I want to do is I want to have this run, let's say every day at midnight. Perfect. So what we want to do is read from our table whenever this flow runs. So let's go to table, and we're going to do search rows. Let's pick our contractor access table. And we want all matching rows. So basically return all of the users in that group, sorry, in that table that match our criteria. And then what we're going to filter on is we want status of staged, and we want activation date less than or equal to current time. Cool. So again, what that's going to do is it's going to look for all the users in the table that are in a stage status and whose activation date is less than the current time. And that's going to return a list that we need to do something with. And the way we can handle a list and to process all the elements in a list is to go to function and pick for each. So basically that's going to iterate over our list. Our list in this case is rows, which is returned from our search rows. And again, it could be just it could be an empty list. It could be one element, or it could be multiple elements in this list. So let's drag that up there. And what it's going to do is it's going to iterate over the list, and it's going to call a child flow or a subflow to process each of those elements individually. And we haven't created one yet, so let's go choose flow, and we're just going to pick in our show folder, pick new flow to create a new flow. All right, let's go ahead and name our subflow. And again, this is kind of a style thing, but since this is a subflow to flow 2, I do something like 2A. And this is activate user on, we'll just call it activate user. And then I'm going to make sure that it's save. And then the trigger for this is a special type of trigger called child flow. Just let that tee up. So child flow under Okta apps. What this allows you to do is to define a list of variables that are passed from the parent flow down into the child flow. So in this case, what I want to do is essentially I'm just going to pick and choose some of the attributes out of the table row that's being passed here to use in this flow. So I'm actually going to call this contractor record. Oops. And I'm going to make this a object. And then I've got individual attributes that I know I need here. So I know I need user ID, I need email, I need row ID, which is the actual row of the row of the table that this data is coming from, and I need the suspend date. All right. Next, we're going to try to activate our user, and it's always a good idea to put things that are calling an API inside of a try-catch block. In the case of Okta workflows, those are called under the error handling tab an if error. So basically, you can see that it's got a try block and sort of an if error, which is a catch block. So what we're going to do inside of here is add an Okta card, and we're going to try activate user. And we do want to send an activation email to our user. Remember, when we created our user, we created them in stage status. So this is going to activate the user and send the activation email. And what we want to do here is just drag the user's user ID here. And that will activate the user. And if the try is true or if the try doesn't fail, then it'll just continue along its way. But what we want to do is in the if error section, we want to function error handling, return error, and then we're just going to return the message from the error that is caught by the API. Go ahead and save that. Okay, last two things I want to do in this flow are to send a Slack message to the group, notifying them that this user has been activated. And then I want to update the table to indicate the user's new status in Okta. In order to do that, I need to read the user from Okta so I can get the latest data. And, so I want to go to read user, and I'm going to want their, let's see, their username, first name, and last name, and status is already selected. So those are the three things I need. Pick done, and I'm just going to drag user ID over here. Cool. And just as before, I can compose a new message. I can say something like contractor first name space last name, maybe in parentheses, put their username has been. And I'm just, rather than assuming that their status is now either provisioned or activated, I'm going to drag their actual status from Okta so we get the real info. And then I'm going to also say their account suspended on, and I'm going to drag their suspend date over just as a reminder that their account will be suspended in 30 days. And go ahead and save. So just like last time, I'm going to send a Slack message. Send Slack message to channel. This is basically the same thing I did in the last one. Oops. No. Send as a by yes. And just drag our output from the compose. And this was onboarding bot. Cool. So the last thing we want to do is update the row in the table for this user to reflect their new status in Okta, because the last flow that runs to suspend users will check that status. So I'm going to go to function, tables, and then I want to update row. Let's go choose our contractor access table. Done. And the only thing we want to do is update the status. So I'm just going to pick status here. Cool. And the row ID we passed in from our parent flow, so I can just grab a row ID from here, drag it over, and I want to change the status. So from this read user card that happened after the activate user, grab the status from there, and that will be the current status of the user. And that's it for this flow. All right, I mentioned earlier that we're going to use Postman to create our users in Okta. So here's an example request. We're basically just calling the users API, passing activate equals false, which will create our user in stage status, so they cannot log in. And then the profile, we're going to pass those two additional profile attributes we added to Okta. So contractor equals true, and then an activation date some point in the future. Let's go ahead and send that. Cool. So we've got our user created. With any luck, we should see a Slack notification come along that is the Slack notification from that first flow. And there it is. New contractor added to Okta. Barry Gibb, activation date 11/25, suspend date 12/25. Perfect.